From Public Radio International, I'm Christopher Lydon. This is Open Source. In the philosophers' pantheon, up there with Aristotle and Plato, Aquinas and Kant, Baruch Spinoza of the 17th century Dutch Enlightenment triggers a peculiar awe and affection. Bertrand Russell called Spinoza the noblest and most lovable of the great philosophers, but that personal attention to the man, not the mind, doubtless rattles Spinoza some. In his geometric and hyper-rational system of thinking, there's scarcely room for the individuality and charisma that glow all around him and his story. He came of a family of Portuguese Jews who found freedom in Amsterdam to be real Jews again. Freedom Spinoza sees to get run out of the synagogue at age 22 for discounting every bond of nation, church, and tribe, but to see and adore God everywhere. On matters of dissent, democracy, the science of emotions, the good life, and God, he's been a touchstone ever since. The short course on Spinoza is next on Open Source. I'm Christopher Lydon. This is Open Source, a radio conversation with digital and metaphysical links at radioopensource.org. The 17th century philosopher Spinoza is the man of this hour. Somebody said the last man who knew all there was to know. He was Rembrandt's contemporary in Amsterdam. Baruch was his Jewish surname, later Christianized to Benedict, though he called himself neither Jew nor Christian. Godzilla versus Bambi on our web thread writes that it was to escape the oppressive intolerance of Judaism and Catholicism that Spinoza elevated pure reason to the limit. He was a universalist before the Genome Project, a lover of God who did not count on being loved back, certainly not individually. We've been calling him the mind of the modern, thirsting to tap into his power this hour. Give us your Spinoza at www.radioopensource.org. Our guests are Spinozists of different stripes. Rebecca Goldstein is a philosopher and novelist. Her book on Spinoza is called Betraying Spinoza, the renegade Jew who gave us modernity. From California, Antonio Damasio is the eminent neuroscientist who now runs the Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. Rebecca, please lead the way. You are both in on the amazing cult that turned up on our website as soon as we posted this show. And for both of you, you and Antonio, there's a kind of personal quest here. Who is your Spinoza? Who is Spinoza to you?
Who is my Spinoza? There are many questions to that. There are many answers there. I think of Spinoza, first of all, in terms of my own personal history, raised as an Orthodox Jew and leaving it, somewhat in the spirit of Spinoza. I'm also a philosopher, and I taught Spinoza for many years. I encountered him, I met him actually on two different occasions, very different kinds of Spinozas that I met. When I was in high school and in a very Orthodox all-girls high school, Spinoza was mentioned in a class on Jewish history when we were beginning to learn about the Enlightenment. And his story was told as a kind of cautionary tale. This is what can go wrong, girls, if you ask the wrong questions. Here was a brilliant man who was born into a certain degree of freedom that his family had suffered to attain, being Marranos in Portugal and coming to Amsterdam, where they were able to openly re-embrace their Judaism.
The Marranos were the forced converts to Catholicism in Spain and Portugal, right?
Exactly. So Judaism had been declared illegal on the Iberian Peninsula, first in Spain in 1492. The majority of Jews who didn't convert in 1492 went to Portugal, and then in 1497, the King of Portugal declared Judaism illegal. So and didn't allow the Jews to leave Portugal. That wasn't an option as it was in Spain, and so they were all forced to convert. Many of them embraced Catholicism and were faithful Catholics. There were a certain degree of the conversos who practiced Judaism in secret, and the Inquisition, the eyes of the Inquisition was on them. It was a very dangerous thing to do. Those were Spinoza's antecedents.
And that was the cautionary tale in your first meeting, as you say.
Exactly.
What was your second meeting?
Well, the second meeting was then I did go on and study philosophy, which, by the way, one of the morals of this story that I was first told was the worst thing you can possibly study is philosophy. Philosophy teaches you to question everything. And that's what we don't want to do. So if you must go to college, and in fact we weren't encouraged in the school to go on to college, but if you must, stay away from the humanities, and by all means, stay away from philosophy. It's the worst thing you can possibly
Which
do.
made it all, of course, irresistible.
Irresistible, in fact. And so while my contemporaries were going about their own adolescent rebelliousness with, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I took a course in philosophy and thought that this is the most radical, rebellious thing I could possibly do. And then I did go on and study philosophy, got my doctorate in philosophy, became a professor of philosophy. I stayed away from Spinoza now, not because I was worried that he was a renegade and a questioner, but because I was brought up in a particular kind of philosophy. I specialized in philosophy of math, philosophy of science, mathematical logic. I was taught that Spinoza's grand metaphysical schemes, trying to deduce the nature of reality through pure reason alone, eschewing science, empirical observation, that this was delusion, that this was metaphysics in the worst sense of the word, in the sense in which the positivists had declared it meaningless. And so I stayed away from him for that reason. So there too he seemed to represent something, again, a kind of cautionary tale. The arrogance of thinking too highly of reason was when I was teaching a course as a professor on Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. These are the 17th century rationalists, the people who made great claims for reason. I was teaching the course because I was interested in Descartes. I was interested in Leibniz. I wasn't really interested in Spinoza. It was while I was teaching it. And teaching his magnum opus, the Ethics, which at first made no sense to me whatsoever, it slowly, I would say probably by the third time I was teaching it, and I apologize to the students for those first 2 years, but by the third time I was teaching it, I saw the hidden presumptions, and the whole thing began to make sense to me, and it was extraordinarily intriguing.
We'll come back to that very, very dense and difficult book, The Ethics, but I want to let Antonio Damasio sort of explain his encounters. Antonio, you're a brain scientist. You virtually stalked the ghost of Spinoza in Amsterdam yourself. What were you looking for, and what did you find? And welcome.
Well, very good. Welcome to you, too. Hi, Chris, and hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Actually, it's interesting. My first thing is I also have two encounters like Rebecca. And my first was when I was an adolescent, and I was actually told that Spinoza was very noble. It was exactly the opposite as the case of Rebecca. Said, this guy is absolutely fabulous. You should read it. You should understand it. This is the person you should copy. And quite frankly, I thought he was noble, but I was not able to copy him or to understand him that well. And then there was a long hiatus, and I came back to Spinoza as a neuroscientist when I realized, especially through my work on emotion research, that in fact Spinoza, in spite of being one of the great rationalists and having this enormous dedication to clear reasoning, was at the same time doing that with a perfect acknowledgement of our very human nature that includes emotion and feeling and the undergirdings of both at its base. And that was really the remarkable revelation. And it was at that point that I went back to Spinoza, and I really couldn't stop. And at a certain point, I felt that I really needed to understand the man as well. And that's when I started actually going to, because I liked Holland as well, I started going to Holland sometimes just on purpose, to visit places where Spinoza had lived and to try to get an understanding of that particular time. Actually, the title of my book, Looking for Spinoza, comes from that, because I would arrive in Amsterdam with Hannah, my wife, who would say, here we are looking for Spinoza. And that's how that came about. So that's my second encounter with Spinoza.
He's stuck with the notion of a sort of Euclidean geometric system of emotions. I mean, a kind of precise architecture, as you would do geometry of passion. He writes at some point of regarding human actions and desires precisely as though I were dealing with lines, planes, and bodies. And yet you say there's a humanist in there too.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, I think that the geometric method, which is so much talked about in relation to Spinoza and particularly the ethics, is actually a bit of an obfuscation of the real thing. And he in his desire to be rigorous, and probably because his training as a scientist, whatever that was at the time, was not as complete as with other men of science of the time, he had to find a way that would give an appearance of rigor, an appearance of objectivity, and geometry was a way into it. I don't think it served him well. I think it just makes the text a bit more impenetrable for the first time reader, but nonetheless the intent was to be rigorous. But behind that rigor and behind a lot of very clear thinking, there is this recognition of the reality of our biology. And for me, Spinoza can have many readings, and Rebecca's is an outstanding one, and very compatible with mine, by the way. But my great interest is in the fact that this man, to a certain degree, is what I would like to call a proto-biologist. At a time in which biology was in its infancy, he was able to think like a biologist. And in fact, he sort of foreshadows a number of great developments in science a couple of centuries later, including, for example, Darwin in many respects, but also quite strongly Claude Bernard, William James, who, by the way, were all influenced by Spinoza, although it was not fancy and fashionable to say so.
And the notion of a single species, equidistant from God, is sort of anticipates the genome in certain ways. But I'm wondering, in a minute to the break, Antonio, can you explain, as a student of neural pathways and the biology of emotion, what it was that Spinoza got right?
Oh, for example, he got right the enormous value of emotion in the reasoning process. For example, there are a couple of quotes that, for your listeners, are very important. Take something like saying that an affect cannot be restrained or neutralized except by a contrary affect that is stronger than the affect to be restrained. This is, sounds a little bit complicated at first, but it's simply saying in a nutshell that if you want to overpower an emotion that is driving you in the wrong direction and is a passion, in fact, the only way you can do that is not by saying no, but by saying no through yet another emotion that is going to be more powerful than the previous one.
Hold that emotion. We're going to take a short break with Antonio Damasio and Rebecca Goldstein on Spinoza. This is Open Source.
Hi, this is Brendan. I'm the open source blogger-in-chief. Julia has been talking to Dutchmen about Spinoza. A poll in the Netherlands in 2004 put him at 21st in the rankings of all-time great Dutchmen, behind Freddie Heineken at place 18. Read it on the site. Also, Chelsea is making phone calls about Katrina and the ongoing wait for insurance settlements. She has learned, for example, that flood insurance might not cover water damage. You were in good hands at radioopensource.org.
Open Source is produced in association with WGBH Radio in Boston. This is Open Source from PRI. I'm Christopher Lydon. This is Open Source. We're talking about Baruch, also known as Benedict Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch, Portuguese, Jewish philosopher, a sort of serene heretic. I'd like to come back to the original question that bedeviled his life and his reputation ever since, in a certain way, but it's the God question, and I'd love Rebecca to take the first crack at it. He was said in the 19th century to be God intoxicated. He talked about his huge, abiding love of God, and yet he also was accused of disappearing God into nature or nature into God and collapsing the whole story, and of course being devoutly unorthodox. Where do you come down on his heterodoxy and the significance of his view about God?
Well, he did identify God and nature. He said that
as the same. Or
Deus sive natura. There is one thing, it can be looked at alternatively as God or as nature. There's two different conceptions of the same thing. The most important thing to realize here is that he's not using this word nature as we use it. I think there's when people first hear this, when I first heard it as a high school student, I thought he was some sort of pantheist and a kind of Native American sort of way, locating God in the babbling brooks and the whispering pines. This is not what he's talking about here. His conception of what nature is first, it's the laws of nature, and even here, his conception of the laws of nature is very unique. Spinoza believed that there's an explanation for everything, and there is an infinite web of necessary connections that constitutes reality. It's almost animated logic, his notion of what nature is. It's the explanation. It's his theory of everything. That's what nature is. It's a complete description of the laws of nature. And not only what these laws are, but why they must be. Everything is explained. Everything is self-explained. If you understand the big picture, you understand why the world has to be the way that it is. That is his conception of nature, and that's the thing that he's identifying with God. It's the thing which explains itself. It's the thing that one's after as a scientist, the big picture, the entire conception of the laws of nature, and even why these are the laws of nature. That's his conception of nature, and that's what he's identifying with God.
Does that separate him from churches for all time, or not?
Well,
sounds
yes
like a
and
perfect
no.
Unitarian.
Well, yes and no, because he does believe that this God, nature's that's identified as God, is an object of adoration. To see it is to love it, is to be filled with awe, is to feel one's own humility and to understand one's place in nature. It makes you better. To understand the nature of reality, right. This Deus sive natura. Knowledge is itself a transformative experience. It makes you better, it makes you happier, it makes you freer. And so it is there's a spiritual dimension to it. And we do love it, and we feel awe toward it. But it's not... We don't pray to it. He who loves God cannot desire that God should love him in return, for example, he says. We can't grovel to it. We can't ask questions of it. It is, so there are some aspects of it which are godlike in the traditional Judeo-Christian Muslim way. And there are other aspects which are irreconcilable with those religions, which he tended to call in the Tractat, in his treatise, his theological political treatise, the superstitious religions. So,
Antonio, I'm wondering how a scientist reads Spinoza on God.
Well, I just wanted to say that I entirely agree with what Rebecca is saying, and I would just add that through that love of nature, which is really a deep understanding of nature, you can get to salvation. So there again, I agree with Rebecca that there's a way in which it is very compatible with what, in fact, is the goal of religions for human beings, and another in which it is not, on aspects that have to do with, say, revelation or the ability to have some kind of mediated dialogue with God. That obviously is outside of the Spinoza range.
He marveled, or responded anyway, to the criticism that he was unorthodox by saying that. By wondering how he could have been said to have thrown off religion when he maintained that, in his words, God must be acknowledged as the highest good and must, as such, be loved with a free mind. Does that rescue him as a believer or not?
Interesting question. There's certain aspects of Spinoza that remain very enigmatic, and probably Rebecca feels the same after living with him for a long time. There's certain things that are never entirely clear. In a way, I think he's a believer, but not quite the same way of the believer of the religions that he regarded as superstitious. So it's again a yes and a no.
Yeah, he always expressed dismay when he was described as an atheist, and I think he was being honest here, that he, by his lights, the way he defined both religion and piety, he was a religious and a pious man, and I don't think that he was being disingenuous when he described himself that way. But you have to understand, he uses words in such a different way. He tells us at one point in the Ethics that he is distorting the usage because he's using words to describe reality, and he's seeing reality in such a unique way. It's not surprising that the vocabulary doesn't quite suit his purposes. So he's trying to use words as so that they conform as much to popular usage as possible. But there is distortion, and he tells us that.
There is a famous Einstein connection in the view of God, and Brendan Greeley, our blogger-in-chief, has been searching it out.
Well, we have a quote from about a month ago on our own blog. Joshua Hendrickson writes, Einstein, when pressed on the subject of whether or not he believed in God, finally answered that he believed in Spinoza's God. Of himself, Joshua writes, I do not believe in Spinoza's God, but that God is the only one that I find remotely plausible. But if we return to the subject of Einstein, it's a question for Rebecca Goldstein. Einstein himself was a Jewish refugee, a religious man, but a kind of a heretic. What about Einstein was Spinozan?
Yes, that's very interesting. I mean, he was being pressed actually when he gave that answer by a rabbi whose name happened to be Goldstein, who wanted to know, was he really a believer? And he said that he believes in Spinoza's God. There are two aspects. There are actually three aspects in which Einstein was really a Spinozist. One was that he located God in the laws of physics and in the beauty and elegance and harmony, he said, of the laws of physics. Two, he agreed with Spinoza that there can be nothing arbitrary about nature. The laws of physics explain themselves. There's nothing arbitrary about them. And some people actually blame this shared Spinozist intuition of Einstein's on Einstein's refusal to accept quantum physics, which isolated him towards the end of his life. But he was such a strong Spinozist that he couldn't accept the randomness of nature, what seemed to him to be arbitrary. And the third respect in which Einstein was a Spinozist was that sort of awe and spiritual attitude toward nature that Tony and I were just describing Spinoza leads us to is one that Einstein expressed many, many times. He talks about losing the religious paradise of his youth, but finding it in physics and in the spiritual aspect of contemplating the beauty, harmony of the laws of physics. And these three ways, Einstein was a true Spinozist.
Antonio, are you willing to share your protobiologist with the physicist? What's the difference here?
Yeah, we can. But let me just say that it's actually very, very moving to go to the Rheinsberg home of Spinoza, which you can visit, and still pretty much as it was in Spinoza's days. And there is a visitor's book. And in the visitor's book, back in the 1920s, there are the entries for Einstein, who went there into that same room. So I thought it was very, very interesting to see that Einstein had been there and that he had done something of a similar travel to the places of a person he really admired. Now back to protobiology. Let me just say that probably the most important. I made mention of the idea of affect. There's something in Spinoza that is really quite remarkable, which has to do with the notion of the conatus. And this, it's difficult to translate. You can translate it as an endeavor, as a tendency, as an effort. effort. Pretty hard word to get in proper English, but it boils down to this: is this irrepressible urge that a living creature will have to maintain itself in life, to preserve itself, to prevail for a certain period, which is the period of allotment of life that its genome gives it. And this is something that Spinoza emphasized over and over again, and is an idea of incredible biological depth. Because what we realize is that, just take human beings, don't go into any other species, but we realize how, except for conditions in which you are clearly ill, like for example in depression, you will have this tendency to maintain your life, to maintain the integrity of your life, and that in fact is carried on until very, very late in life, and only at the very end does that break down, again probably because of very strong genetic mechanisms which allow that breakdown to take place. And Spinoza recognized this, and he recognized that the way for this maintenance, for this self-preservation and this prevailing was in fact given through this enormous flourishing of the emotions that were really of two kinds, the positive and the negative, and the positive ones really allowed you to sustain yourself and to continue. It's quite. I was just thinking about it. I was writing just a couple of days ago about William Styron, the novelist who, in addition to his novels, gave us a very extraordinary book about depression, Darkness Visible, and I was struck once again reading it by this paragraph in which he describes how, when he was at a point of suicide, how all of a sudden something came from within that stopped him from continuing it. And that's actually one of the great descriptions in the English language of exactly what the conatus of Spinoza's is about, is this force that keeps you going, and is in fact apparent in all biological tissue, and you can find it in one single cell or in a multicellular organism, but it's really a great, profound discovery for a man who, of course, had no biological science tools to do so. At a time in which about the only thing you knew was, say, the circulation of blood, and it was about it in terms of general but specific biology.
In the case of Styron, the Brahms Alto Rhapsody also figured too, but
Exactly.
You're talking about that was the sort of the accompaniment to
exactly.
that profound point. Would you come back to the matter of his rationality or hyper-rationality? It was suggested that by one of you a moment ago, and maybe on the website too, that he believed that there was literally redemption through reason, which is an unorthodox point. But he also believed it was the great universal connector, and you've touched on that, Antonio. But what are the dimensions of this reason, and what are the limits of it?
Well, I don't think I can answer that, posed in those terms exactly. One thing that is very important is to maintain this connection between the emotion and the reason. The reason in Spinoza is never disembodied, and it is never taken out of emotion as a drive. So there is the great power of observation and the enlightenment that comes from more and more rigorous observation. But it's as if all of this is constantly being fueled by the pleasurable states that discovery and more rigorous description will give you. And it's a little bit hard to get the first time you read it, because one's usual tendency is to focus on the reason, on the rational aspect. But it's there as the undergirding of the entire edifice of Spinoza's thinking.
Did not history judge that he overstated the case for reason, Rebecca?
Well, we have yet to see, actually. There are many physicists who are trying to vindicate his view. I mean, there are string theorists who sound just like Spinoza. Stephen Hawking, at the end of A Brief History of Time, a very famous paragraph in which he says that, when we reach this final theory and we understand not only why the laws of nature are as they are, but why they had to be, this will be the ultimate triumph of reason, for then we will know the mind of God. And this is a very Spinozistic sentiment. So we've yet to see, right, if it is a guiding principle for many scientists, especially physicists. But
Roger Scruton, a British writer, says about Spinoza much the same thing, that Spinoza does not abandon religion. He shows a path through the woods. And he says, at the end, after disenchantment, by the very process which disenchants the world, science, we come to a new enchantment, recognizing God in everything and loving his works in the very act of discovering them.
Yes, but I mean, of course, with Spinoza, you always have to remember that God is not transcendent. God didn't choose this world. God isn't apart from this world. God is the world. God is immanent. God isn't transcendent. So that's the Spinozist element. The other thing I wanted to touch on was this, as Tony had stressed, the very, very important concept of quantitas, that this striving, this endeavor for each organism to maintain itself and to flourish in the world. There's a dark side to that also that Spinoza emphasizes. One of the things that Spinoza is most concerned with is false beliefs. There is a way, and he's particularly interested in dogmatic, ideological, religious intolerance. This was in fact the concern that animated his life, and which again makes him so very current. His burning concern was in fact religious intolerance, and how the religion of reason that he was proposing could defang religious intolerance. To the extent that we're rational, we're all going to agree. We're all going to partake. It's the same universe, the same eternal universe that we'll be contemplating. That's what our minds will be constituted of. This contemplation of this universe, to some extent, we'll all have exactly the same mind. So it's a very
2007 globalist genomic insight, and it's important to this world at this moment, I think.
Yeah, this is what makes him of such really urgent relevance at this moment. And Quantitas, he also said, this great striving that each thing has to maintain itself. We all regard this one thing that we happen to be as singularly important.
Hold it there for the moment. We're going to come back after a short break, and you've mentioned tolerance, but he is also a hero in any notion of dissent, also democracy, also human rights, law, as we said, biology and physics. He is a man for all seasons. We're talking about the late, great Spinoza on Open Source. We'll be back. I'm Christopher Lydon. This is Open Source. We're talking about the 17th century Dutch philosopher Spinoza, who seems to be part of so many contemporary conversations. Our guests are Antonio Damasio, the brain scientist, and Rebecca Goldstein, philosopher and novelist. I'd love to just touch on some of these many, many points in which he is a modern. Antonio, could we talk about democracy? Could we talk about dissent? Could we talk about human rights in his world and ours?
Sure. Well, if somebody can write something like "Let every man think what he wants and say what he thinks," that's pretty hard stuff. And that's one of the things that is said. I think Rebecca will be even better than myself to comment on that. But I think it's extremely strong and as you said, quite 2007. We do need that right now. Just touch on one thing on the issue of physics and biology. It's really quite intriguing to think that now both biologists and physicists and philosophers commenting on both will have Spinoza being claimed for their particular interests and areas, and that, of course, just reinforces the notion of how universal he was. I'm reminded of many conversations that I had with Stuart Hampshire, who, as Rebecca knows, was one of the great Spinozists of mid-20th century. In fact, by the 1950s, he had one of the great books on Spinoza, and Stuart always thought that the great importance of Spinoza and the way he described his world was clearly related to physics, and physicists were the ones that would most draw on his ideas. And I tried to convince him that biology was just as important, and I'm very glad to say that in the end he agreed with me, and he thought, well, at least those two he certainly was important for.
Rebecca, make the connection with human rights, Spinoza and human rights issues in this world today, or democracy for that matter, or
okay, both of them actually. For Spinoza, the most important faculty that we have in terms of our pleasure, our freedom, our happiness, and our salvation is reason. And we can't abrogate reason. It's everybody's responsibility. There are certain rights we can give up, and we can give them up to the government in order for ourselves to have security. But that we can never give up our obligations to reason things out. This is what makes us human, and this is where our salvation lies. He felt that democracy was the one form of government that would preserve this. A government that doesn't allow freedom to think. For him, I should say, government, the justification for government, the rationale for government, the rationalization of it, is that it gives us enough security so that we can get on with the important business of life, which is to philosophize, which is to think, which is to see the universe as it is, and to see our relationship to this universe. This is what we all ought to be after. And government exists to give us enough security so that we can do this. Any government that takes away our freedom to think, takes away our complete freedom to philosophize, any religious system that does this has delegitimized itself, so that, this is something that government can't do for us. Government can't barge in. It can't interfere with our right and obligation to think.
What has come of his sort of beyond national, beyond ethnic, beyond tribal and group arguments? He felt them militantly, and yet, of course, he remains the argument in your book, an intensely Jewish mind and Jewish figure, a hero in Israel, a hero in the diaspora. What of the notion that, and he had it early, that it's one species and that the divisions are accidental and maybe mischievous?
Yeah, an ambiguous hero, I would have to say. That he still provokes passions. There are still people, and I learned this when I published my book, still people within the Jewish community who regard him as a traitor. And it would even attack me because of my reverence for him. So that he's quite ambiguous. But Spinoza wants us to take responsibility for ourselves, for the contents of our mind. We may not be able to control all the externals of our lives. Of course, we can't. We're passive as regards so much. We come into this world and we exit this world, and over neither of these monumental events in one's own life does one have any control. And all sorts of things impinge on one's life over which one has no control. The one thing that we can control is how we think about these things. And we can understand everything in the world. And the contingencies that define us, the particular group that we were born into, geographical, religious, gender, any of these aspects have nothing really to do, or ought to have nothing really to do with the way we see the world. It's one world. It's the same for all of us. That's what we ought to be focused on. And to the extent that we are, that is, to the extent that we're rational, all of these accidental, contingent aspects of our identity shrivel away. And in fact, even one's own attachment to oneself, to a certain extent, to this one thing which one is, eventually shrivels away, which is why he says the free man thinks least of all things upon his own death.
This kind of point...
I agree. And
go ahead.
And let me just say one thing, Chris.
Damasio.
The idea, this respect for reasoning and truth in oneself, together with the benefits of a democratic society in which you are inserted, are in fact paths for salvation in Spinoza. In other words, there is a sort of very complex level of salvation that will come when you are really in that immense contemplation of God in his view. But it really passes through an earlier level that includes the democratic state, which protects you, and this enormous respect for reason and truth, and you cannot you cannot achieve salvation without those. So that's really integral to Spinoza.
These points about groups and identities have been argued to a fairly well on our website. It's fascinating, both what people know and the passion they bring to it. Godzilla versus Bambi says Spinoza was using reason as a means of escape from reality, effectively claiming that reality doesn't count because he chooses to ignore it. Okay, what about the Jewish masses? The Jewish suffering in Spinoza's time was not irrelevant if you were Jewish. Sutter, on the other hand, wrote a week ago on this site, from Spinoza's perspective, the view from eternity, his own perspective, and that of his fellow dispossessed Jews, is irrelevant. To claim otherwise, says Sutter, is to acknowledge the importance of contingency and context as opposed to pure reason in rendering ethical judgment. I take your point, Rebecca, that we can at least think clear, and we must think clear of the categories, whatever neighborhood we were born into.
Yes, this is what it is to be rational for Spinoza. The truth is never the truth from my point of view. There's truth. He's an advocate of radical objectivity. There is the world as it exists out there. What the contemporary philosopher, in fact, he was my PhD dissertation advisor, Thomas Nagel, calls the view from nowhere. The things as they are simply in and of themselves, and what he called sub specia aeternitatis, that is, Spinoza called the view that we get under the guise of a certain form of eternity. It's the view. Truth doesn't. He's not a relativist. He is the farthest thing from a relativist, and so there's one truth for all of us, and it can't be determined by what group you happen to be born into. But Spinoza as a Jew is an interesting story. Spinoza, and this actually came to me as a surprise because I only looked at Spinoza as a philosopher, as somebody who had been influenced by Descartes and then went on to influence Leibniz, as the middle figure in this very fascinating movement of 17th century rationalism. I never really thought about Spinoza as Jewish, as somebody who had behind him an entire history that was filled with Jewish suffering. This is true. This was the greatest calamity for the Jews, that is the Spanish-Portuguese Inquisition, until the 20th century. It was a time of tremendous suffering for the Jews in Spain and in Portugal. And these were Spinoza's immediate antecedents. And there are places where he, especially in certain letters, where he actually betrays not only a deep knowledge of this history, as he would have to have. This was his contemporary story. There were refugees arriving from Portugal all through his childhood and beyond. But he also betrays a kind of emotional reaction to this story of suffering. The Jews.
What was it?
Well, there is one very, very interesting letter from a former student of his, Albert Berg, who had made a trip to Italy and converted to Catholicism, and then wrote back to Spinoza, his former mentor, in a very obnoxious way, urging him to convert to Catholicism, to save his soul, and being really quite insulting to Spinoza, saying, you think you know everything, but how do you know everything? And Spinoza answers Berg, and Berg also talks about the great martyrdom of the Christian saints. And this is one place where Spinoza actually loses his famous philosophical cool. And he begins in a dispassionate way, but he then starts writing to Berg, look, if you want to talk about martyrs, I'll give you martyrs. And he starts talking about Jewish martyrs, and in particular one Jewish martyr who had been burned at the stake in an auto da fe in Portugal with tremendous passion, and in a way that actually is very, very different from his writing anywhere else in any of his other letters. So I think that Spinoza is not indifferent to this story. One of the things he's really trying to solve is the problems of Jewish history. Why is this people picked on? Why is it made to suffer in so many ways? What can we do to think our way out of all such episodes of intolerance? And he's trying to solve one of the fundamental problems of Jewish history, which he felt keenly, the problem of suffering, of Jewish suffering.
Rebecca, in her book, Antonio has dealt with this whole question of, are we somehow dishonoring or betraying Spinoza by taking such an intense interest in himself, in the man? How do you approach that, the man and the mind?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. How do in terms of what?
Well,
I'm not quite sure what you're aiming.
Are we discounting his doctrine in a way by being so taken with the man? His history.
No.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's very, he's such an intriguing thinker, and obviously with such depth and such a possibility of readings, that I think it's very interesting to find about his setting, and his setting is really quite unique. And as any listener can gather from little bits of our conversation with Rebecca, it's obviously this is a very complex story. Even the names of this man. This is a man that is born to Portuguese Jews and is given the name of Bento, which is the Portuguese name for blessed, and then adopts a Jewish community name of Baruch, which means the same, but eventually turns over to yet another name, which is Benedictus. So it's very interesting because there are many creatures behind this man, which correspond to his actually rather short life, but a life of very rapid development. And I don't think we're doing at all a disservice by inquiring about who he was and where he lived and how he lived. And it's also, it's a period of history that is remarkable. He was living in a remarkable place, by the way, because very often people forget that he was living in a republic, basically in a beginning, a forerunner of democracy as we know it, with enormous amounts of liberty up to a certain point, provided you would, of course, not offend the powers that be in a very deep way, which is, of course, what he proceeded to do, and led to his excommunication, quote unquote. But I think it's important to know something about the times to understand what was going on in the thinking. And I think the relation, for example, philosophically to both Descartes and Leibniz that follows is intriguing too. And from a point of view of neurobiology, for example, from the point of view of understanding what the mind is and what the body, what the relation is of the mind and the body, again, Spinoza is very important, but you cannot just listen to him. You have to listen to him in the context of what came before him. That was his mentor, and that was Descartes,
Yes.
and a person that he separates himself from quite clearly, although they are in fact they overlap in time.
He was. I want to know who plays him in the movie. He died in his 40s. He never married, yet he believed in happiness. He strove, he said, as far as human virtue allows, to act well, as they say, and rejoice. I'd like to ask you both very briefly, granted that the ethics is very difficult reading, where's to begin getting better acquainted with, to me, this irresistible man? Rebecca? 1, 2, or 3 books, starting with your own Betraying Spinoza?
Well, we have mentioned Stuart Hampshire's book, Spinoza and Spinozism. The philosopher Jonathan Bennett has an excellent study of the ethics. But it's really, this is one philosopher that really requires a very good teacher, in fact. And my favorite thing to teach is always an advanced course on Spinoza.
Next time you give the course, call us. Antonio Damasio, besides looking for Spinoza, give us a book or two.
I think that Rebecca's, for example, and Stuart Hampshire's would be another good place to go. But as Rebecca said, it's very tough. It's not. It needs a guide.
Thank you, Antonio Damasio. Thank you, Rebecca Goldstein.
Thank you.
Thank you, Baruch Benedict Spinoza. You can keep talking about philosophy.